Okay, it is 2 o'clock, so this session of the Darlington Local Plan Examination hearings is now open. I'm William Fieldhouse, the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to carry out independent examination of the Darlington Local Plan. So this session, like the others, will be a structured discussion of the items set out on the agenda that was published some time ago for this afternoon. Just one point to make, though, those aware, some will be aware, that there was one item that we didn't finish discussing this morning. It's just the last item that I brought up this morning, which was about policy ENV5, and that's about the green standard space provision on development sites. So we're going to finish that off first, and then we'll move on to the other 4 items that were on the agenda originally. So apologies to those of you who are attending this afternoon for other matters, but we do just need to finish that off. Excuse me. Okay, so I won't go through all the opening because I think you've all participated before, but I will just ask each participant who's listed on the agenda and those that have been invited subsequent to this morning, if they could introduce themselves briefly. When you do, you can turn your microphone and camera on, and then turn the microphone and camera off when you finish, please. So David Hand for the council.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. Yeah, David Hand, Head of Planning Policy, Economic Strategy and Environment, representing the council. Thank you.
And David Nelson.
Good afternoon, sir. David Nelson, Principal Planning Policy Officer, representing Darlington Borough Council.
And Fiona McCall.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Fiona McCall, Planning Policy Officer, representing the council.
And Michael Williams from JBA Consultants.
Hello, Principal Flood Risk Analyst, JBA Consulting, representing the council.
Okay. Right, anyone else representing the council today?
Myself, sir, Matthew O'Shea.
Yes, sorry about that.
No problem. Matthew O'Shea, Planning Officer at Darlington Borough Council.
Okay, apologies. Right, other participants, James Seabury.
Good afternoon, sir. James Seabury, representing the Banks Group.
Tom Baker.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Baker of Savills, and I'm representing Story Homes.
James Hall.
Afternoon, sir. James Hall for Bellway Homes.
Councillor Gilsonan. No, I'm told she's not here this afternoon.
Or Chrissy.
Or neither Chrissy Marshalsea. Ken Madison.
Good afternoon, sir. My name's Ken Madison, and I'm representing myself.
Councillor Snedker.
Good afternoon. I'm back again for the afternoon session representing Darlington Green Party.
And Joe Ellis.
Good afternoon, sir. Joe Ellis, Blue Kayak Planning, representing Darlington Green Party.
And Musa Chowdhury.
Good afternoon, sir. Musa Chowdhury, representing the Church Commissioners for England.
Okay, Martin Bonner.
Good afternoon, everybody. Martin Bonner, Savills, representing Helen's Land and Homes England.
And Joanne Lund, sorry, I think also representing the Green Party.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm representing Darlington Green Party on the issue of health and wellbeing.
Okay, thank you. Right, Stephen Longstaff.
Afternoon, sir. Stephen Longstaff from ELG Planning, representing Taylor MP.
Okay, I think Michael Green is Michael Green there? I don't think he is he? I think he's decided he doesn't need to attend this afternoon. Okay, and David Clark.
Good afternoon, everybody. David Clark, represent myself as a concerned resident. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else there that I've missed off or is hoping to participate this afternoon that hasn't introduced themselves? No, okay. Right, just a reminder then, if you wish to contribute to the discussion at any particular time, just put the raise your hand icon up and I'll bring you in. When I do, turn your microphone and camera on. When you're finished, if you can remember to turn your camera and microphone off, please. Okay, so we've got 5 items now on the agenda for this afternoon. I hope to finish before 5 o'clock, but we can go on that until then if we do. We'll probably have a break around 3:15, something like that, unless it looks like we've nearly finished, at which point we may just carry on. So I'm going to come back to ENB5 in a minute, but before I do that, are there any procedural questions that anybody wishes to raise before I do? No, okay. Right, so, I mean, we got through my initial question to the council about policy ENB5, and I think I've clarified a few things. But there were some modifications to it, which bring in some of the sort of references to the SPD and the sort of formula approach that's set out in there. Mr. Rush has clarified some. I suppose one of the key points, if we can just get clarification, I'm pretty sure this is the case, that the opening sentence of paragraph of ENB5 would refer to the SPD. This is the planning obligations SPD or its replacement. No, yes, yes, it would. And just consideration of the standards, I think, was the phrase that was in the modification, wasn't it?
That was the one that was in the original. I think we've had the further discussion, haven't we, since at the other sessions around having regard to. So I'm not sure whether that was one of the ones that we identified in that further list following the first week of sessions.
Yeah, maybe. Anyway, I've noted that. So the point is, you would have regard to the relevant supplementary planning document or its replacement. So that's the starting point. We then come on to the policy ENB5, and I think we've established that basically what this is saying is that for sites of 20 houses or more, or 1,000 square metres of non-residential, the expectation is that, taking account of what exists already in the area, you meet any additional needs for the development on site. That for smaller sites of 11 or more, but I think it's up to 20, but you might want to clarify that now. We can chance to have a think about it. As a different approach, which is basically saying a financial contribution would be sought if there's a deficiency of some sort of open space in the area, and that could be to either improve the quality of what exists or to improve the quantity of something that exists. And again, that would be related to the additional need that is arising from the development of that size. Have you had a chance to clarify whether it is 11 to 19 dwellings or 10 to 19 dwellings or what?
Yes, it would be 11 to 19.
Yeah, okay. So the different approaches are for 20 or more, you provide on site. For smaller than that, it's 11 to 19. Okay, right. So okay, that's fine, and I can think about the actual. I mean, as I've looked again at I'd looked at the SPD some time ago, and I hadn't had time to look at it again before this morning session. So I've had another look at it, and I recognise the sort of the summary of what's been put in. You're suggesting we put in the reason justification. I can decide whether that's necessary or not. It doesn't. I think what I had in mind was if there are standards in the SPD, should they be in the plan? It doesn't. What your modification does is not introduce the standards in the plan, but it does sort of just summarise a sort of an approach, which I'm not necessarily convinced is necessary or to make the plan sound, so long as the reference is having regard to the SPD. That's the sort of, and the policy then does a limited number of things, which sets out, as I said, the expectations for on or off-site provision. So which brings me on to the issue raised by Joe Ellis, actually, about what's the purpose of this list of 1 to 5. When I looked again at the SPD, I noticed that it seems to say that in some parts of the borough there are shortages of, say, children's play area. In others, there are shortages of wildlife-friendly green space, but it also itemises some other sort of priorities about playing pitches, and there's other things. So I don't quite see the purpose of that list, and also the point that Joe Ellis made about multifunction. When you get to the bottom of the list, you read the next paragraph. It says that they should be designed to be multifunctional, providing a range of uses. So I'm just wondering whether there's any purpose in that list of 1 to 5. So that's the question, I think, now for you, Mr. Usher.
I think the purpose of that list was to give a clear indication of the priorities that were identified through the Green Infrastructure Strategy. So the Green Infrastructure Strategy identified, those areas in priority of need across the borough as a whole. So the purpose of that section was to reflect that. I think the references that Joe Ellis was cross-referencing to are in the planning obligations SPD. Now that table was just for a specific short-scale time frame for a year or so. It was intended that would be updated, but that update hasn't taken place. So those priorities a link back to the green infrastructure strategy rather than the planning obligations SPD. But yes, I mean, it was just to give an idea of the preferences and priorities. But as you say, it could potentially vary on a site by site basis. So, we would be open to, looking at whether it's necessary to include it in that nature in the policy.
Isn't the point as well that whilst the green infrastructure strategy may have identified overall for the borough the priority, but when you come to any development site, it depends on what's in the locality, doesn't it? So
well, that's correct, sir. Yes.
Yeah. So maybe the reference. I mean, in terms of the areas of deficiency. Your modification to ENV5, the last paragraph, when it talks about areas of open space deficiency, that says identified in the planning obligations SPD or replacement. But I think you're saying that's not up to date and that the green infrastructure strategy is more up to date. So why is reference to deficiency to a 2013 SPD?
Because that's where they were last identified, so.
Perhaps the way around this is to sort of simplify this somewhat, to go back, leaving aside the modifications you propose. I mean, some of it might be necessary, but maybe the point is to establish this policy, where you say the two things that it does do, when on site and when off site is appropriate, that you should have regard to the SPD, and that the green infrastructure should be multifunctional, but on any particular site, it should take account of or have regard to the green infrastructure strategy or other evidence about needs in the locality or something of that nature. Because I think that's what you're saying, isn't it? That in any particular look about what exists around and then you think about what on-site provision should be. Okay. Okay, I don't think I've got any other questions. Is there anything else you want to say on having a bit of chance to reflect over a short lunch break?
No, I think that's it. So I think, yes, agree, we can look to clarify it better as you just suggested there. So yes,
Okay, right. Any other comments from anyone else in relation to ENV5? Either you didn't have a chance this morning to comment, or because you've had time to think, or in response to what you've just heard. If not, and there seems to be not, I'll move on. Thank you for that. So let's move on to what was the first item originally on the afternoon agenda, which was about policy DC1. We've already, to some extent, discussed this because under I think it was on day one probably, when we talked about climate change, there was some issues raised. Obviously, things have moved on a little bit since then in terms of the way that any of these SPDs are referred to in the plan, and this would be having regard to. And the SPD would be reviewed. I don't want to go back over the ground we've dealt with about elements of that planning obligations SPD. Sorry, design of new development SPD, which is the one referenced here. But, are out of date as some see it. But is there any further comments that people wish to make about policy DC1 that haven't already been made? No? Okay. Yeah, Councillor Snedker. Sorry, I might have a bit of a delay because Liz just pointed out that your hand had gone up and it hadn't appeared on mine, but it has now. So bear with me. If I'm having the problems I've had previously, I might have to leave and come back. But at the moment, it seems to be working just about. So, Councillor Snedker.
Yes, it's. I take on board you're saying we did do quite a lot of work on this one, and the way that the SPD seems to demote the design requirements from something that has to be done to something that has to be regarded. And this is such a timely problem for building. Once a house is built, it's built for good, and it seems a shame that officers are being put in a position where they don't have the strength to ensure that future houses meet paragraphs 149 and 150 of the NPPF, and just pointing to the fact that other plans, particularly the London plan and Bristol and Stroud as well, have successfully passed as sound, with a stronger objective for the provision of the Climate Change Act. And I would say that they were more sound because they were compliant with the NPPF paragraphs 149 and 150. And we have suggested changes to both the strategic objective 4 and this item as well in our report that we commissioned from the, scanning through my documents there, from the Centre for Sustainable Energy. Yeah. So they are an opportunity for us to make a sound plan that is fit for future Darlington homes.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll take Jo Ellis also on behalf of the Green Party.
Okay, just to back up Councillor Snedker's comments, I think there's the point about demotion of the SPD is very relevant, because with the SPD kind of concerned as in effect a kind of an annex to the plan has a very good design philosophy. Without it, it mostly concerns aesthetics more than functionality. So it mentions sense of place, it mentions local context, it mentions views, natural surveillance. It does touch on energy consumption, it touches on parking, and then it talks about layout and green infrastructure to complement and enhance ecology. So it doesn't talk about a lot of the things which the design SPD includes, such as connectivity, legibility, building configuration and massing, service provision, density. So all of the things that contribute to what we would now talk of in terms of the 15-minute city, where people are able to access the services and facilities they need by sustainable or active transport within a 15-minute walk. And I really feel as though that the omission of that point means that almost at the last minute, at the kind of main modification stage, the design element of the plan is being returned from an actually quite strong one to an actually quite weak one. And so therefore we would argue that a summary of the measures within the design SPD should be incorporated within the policy. Obviously, it's not possible. Take the points that has been made about how you're not examining the SPDs and how they are a separate document and all the rest of it. But if the plan really wants to deliver sustainable design, it should say so.
Well, I think it does say so, but it's about how far it takes it, isn't it, in terms of specificity. So if you were to look at the criteria, say you took the energy efficiency one, criteria C in DC1, low carbon energy efficiency measures and low carbon technologies will be encouraged. So yes. I will look back at your statement and the report that you commissioned. But what just tell, as an example, so if necessary we can discuss it. How would that be strengthened to reflect either the SPD or something more up to date or more ambitious?
Okay, well, obviously, specifically with regard to in energy efficiency, time has moved on since the SPD was produced. And we're now obviously in a situation where local authorities are supposed to be aiming towards net zero, and the Centre for Sustainable Energy's report lists a number of policies from other local authorities where they put in specific requirements for energy. So the example from the London plan, which I think Councillor Snedker mentioned, states a minimum on-site reduction in emissions of at least 35% beyond building regulations is required for major residential development. And there are other policies which require specific standards in in excess of building regulations for energy efficiency, for example.
Okay, so the way you could express it to be more challenging would you say to express it in terms of an improvement over the building regs?
Yeah, you could, and there are other things like, for example, the planning the design SPD sets standards for the amount of energy that should be obtained through decentralised or low carbon sources of energy. Now we appreciate that the plan contains a mention of district heating, but it doesn't actually set standards for low carbon sources of energy to be provided to even larger scale developments.
Okay. Okay, right, understood. So there are ways of doing it that be more specific and be more ambitious that aren't in the plan. Yeah. Okay, and going back to Stedka's point, the soundness issue with that is NPPF 149, 150 is about radical reductions and positive strategy and those sort of things. So that's the rationale for that. Okay, thank you. Right, Ken Madison.
Hi, yes, thank you very much indeed. I'm certainly no expert. Can you see my picture or not?
No, but I think you might be about to appear. No, your camera, I don't think your camera's on.
Yeah, I don't know what's happened there. Something's gone wrong with the camera. It was working this morning. I brought this point up last week, I think it was, about DC1, and in particular Section C, which actually I think you've just read out, sir. Yeah. I think that's pretty weak. I'm not an expert on any of this, if I was to be absolutely honest, but the SPD, as you've described, and I haven't read it, is in the plan. This is the policy for the Darlington Borough Council for a 20-year block. My understanding is that we are fairly well advanced in terms of what we are looking for. As far as I'm aware, the Borough Council have got a green energy policy. I don't know how specific that is, but maybe that should actually be incorporated within this design suitability. I appreciate that things like solar panels, wind turbines, but the one that sticks in my head are boilers. There is already an announcement that boilers will not be used using gas beyond, I think it's 2025. It might even be shorter than that. And I appreciate that that becomes quite specific and a little bit too much detail. But I think this is an opportunity for the Borough Council to put a stamp on where we are as a council. But it also might affect viability. And I appreciate that. I'm pretty sure that there'll be a queue of developers waiting to speak now to say that, no, we can't go down that line. But I think it's an opportunity to be aspirational. There's been a number of things that the council have put in that is aspirational. And this is about a vision and looking forward. And I think there's an opportunity to get it right.
Okay, well put, understood. Thank you, Mr. Madison. I mean, I suppose going back to looking at the reason justification for policy DC1, the last part of it, well, no, sorry, 5.1.10 does refer quite clearly to the building regulations and basically says these are going to continue to be improved and that's kind of the way that will go forward. And policy DC1 encourages potentially beyond that, but it doesn't set any requirements. And that's the decision that the council's made in its plan. I suppose going back to Councillor Seneca's point, well, is that consistent with national policy? I have to say it's a bit difficult to say really that if the government expected plans, well, to development to go beyond what the standards are, it would update the building regulations to do it rather than rely on local authorities. That's not to say there can be examples of some authorities who do wish to go further and have chosen to do so. Some may have justified the approach, others may not. Anyway, I think that's just setting my kind of understanding of the sort of context. And I think we'll get points now from the development industry side, as Mr. Madison predicted. Mr. Baker.
Thank you, sir. So I obviously don't want to go over the ground that we discussed on the sort of first tranche of sessions a few weeks ago, but we would, overall we would support the modification in the council's response to the preliminary questions, which changes the wording from follow to consider. I think we do have concerns that the policy, and there's not a modification before the examination, the policy still refers to the 2001 SPD. We note that there will be flexibility by the changing of the wording to should or required to consider. But I still think this does provide uncertainty, given that a significant proportion of the 2011 SPD is out of date. Really, I think the policy and the modification should refer to the updated SPD that the council says in production and could be prepared imminently. And then there would be clarity through that SPD process as to the correct and most up-to-date standards that this local plan would require. So I think that's the correct approach, rather than leaving it to a development management decision as to whether you're following something or just considering it. I think the best approach would be to refer to a new SPD being produced, and the development should consider that SPD. And if anything, that's a driver for this SPD to be produced in a timely manner for this plan to rely on.
Okay, so the policy itself should set out the policy, and the SPD should follow it, I think is the point, isn't it?
I think that's correct.
Consistent. Yeah.
Yeah, there is a footnote in the policy that refers to the 2011 SPD. I think it should say it should delete that and say refer to a new SPD that's in production and will be produced imminently.
Yeah.
And then we will be able to, in terms of the standards within that SPD, obviously that will be uncertain as we sit here today, but we can rely on the robustness of the SPD process to ensure that those standards are correct and appropriate for an SPD document.
Even though it's not independently examined.
Well, of course, but it does. There is a regulatory process that it has to go through. It's subject to formal consultation, for example.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's helpful, Mr. Baker. Thank you for that. I'll obviously give that some thought as to, I mean, to the extent that there's important things in the SPD, and this goes back to the generalities point as well, you'd expect them to be reflected in policy DC1. So the key stuff should be in DC1, and then any detail about implementing it should come through the SPD. And as you say, that should really follow on from this policy, which should be up to date and reflect national policy now, not 2011. So
that's precisely. That's precisely it. Yes, I mean we have set that out in our matter statement that where the local plan through an SPD is requiring significantly enhanced measures around sustainability or environmental enhancements, they can have viability considerations that can affect plan-wide viability. So we would expect that this is more about requiring detail rather than anything new or over and above.
And I suppose going back to getting too bogged down, but in terms of the implications of viability, if the SPD, despite the representations made by yourselves and others during the regulatory consultation process, etc., well, if you did introduce a standard that hadn't been reflected in the viability assessment for the local plan, that would be one of the circumstances that the PPG would allow you to sort of point to and say, well, that's clearly something that's been introduced and circumstances have changed, and give you a justification for negotiating on an individual scheme. Not the ideal way forward, but at least it's another mechanism, isn't it, to sort of ensure fairness, if you see what I mean.
Exactly, yeah, and obviously you have this additional flexibility within DC1, which is to consider those measures rather than prescriptively to follow.
Yeah. Okay, right, thank you. Right, Mr. Bonner.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Baker covered most of the points I wanted to raise. Appreciate we've been through them before in any case. It's just the specific wording with regard to for the consistency in the plan. This may have been covered in the last conversation, but obviously just the very nature of these things, they do change over time. So having that with regard to it doesn't necessarily have to be seen as a weak measure. It could be used both ways, really. So if what's in the next SPD is out of date, then there may be more measures to consider or other things to consider as well. So it's that flexibility in our view is appropriate to make sure that this is a sound policy.
Okay, thank you. Musa Chowdhury.
Thank you, sir. I think Mr. Baker's covered it well. Just to reiterate, the SPD is dated, and I think you summed it up quite well, sir. That you said the key elements should be contained within the policy, and then the SPD rather should follow the policy once adopted.
Okay, that's clear. I've got that. Thank you. Right. Anything else on DC1 that anybody wishes to say? I mean, does the council want to respond? Presumably, I mean, just Mr. Nelson, presumably the key principles are brought out from your old SPD, which is 10 years old, are reflected in DC1, are they not?
Yes, sir. And any that are covered in other policies that we may cover tomorrow, I suspect, in relation to things like access and accessibility as well. Yeah. That you know, there are a few references to the design SPD. I mean, if I could just say in relation to the SPD and why we're keen to keep the reference in there, but acknowledge it needs an update. I mean, there's a lot of information in that design SPD that is just good design principles and probably will be quite timeless, to be honest. You know, it won't change. There's a lot of work gone into local characterization that's fed into that document. So I think there's a lot of it that still should carry weight and is still informative to development. I think where it has dated is in the references to things like national standards and things like that, which have changed. So, you know, we don't argue that those elements need updating, but equally there's a lot of good information still in that document. So that's why we're looking at more of a review rather than a total replacement, if you like. Okay, well, when will this SPD be altered? When will the new version be published? I mean, we're looking to do it as very soon as we can. Once we've finished with examinations and things like that, we'll get started on it, you know, for the rest of the year. I'm guessing probably early next year. We could look to have something. Okay, so okay. Right, okay, thank you. Anything else on DC1 before we move on? No, I mean, probably just to reiterate the points that have been made around viability, that obviously, you know, not going over that again, our evidence indicates we've got a probably generally marginally viable plan. Some sites, are showing as not viable for various reasons. I suspect our viability work will look very different than those that support the London plan or the Bristol plan, as was quoted there. So just to acknowledge that, that the viability has to play a role. And we're waiting to see what happens with future homes standards as well. And there's definitely uncertainty and overlap, if you like, between planning and building regulations as well. I know the government seem to keep changing the mind as to whether that side of things is just left to building regs, or, you know, if there is scope for planning to play a role. But our evidence indicates that with a marginally viable plan, that we don't have scope to go above what building regs and normal construction techniques are at the moment. Okay, thank you. Right. Okay. We'll Jo Ellis, final point on DC1.
Thank you, sir. First thing is, I would dispute, as I've already said, I'd dispute the assertion that the major points from the design SPD are reiterated in the plan, because, as I say, things like connectivity, density, and etc., which actually don't necessarily add anything to the cost of a development, aren't included. And the other points I'd like to make is, yes, viability is important, but it's also important for local authorities to meet their obligations under the Climate Change Act, and it's important to mitigate climate change. So I think, you know, the comment that we can't have stronger design policies because that would undermine viability is a kind of, first of all, it's very negative, and second of all, it falls down on two counts.
I always wonder with this. I mean, if building standards need to be different to achieve the government's national legally binding targets and move to net zero, well, the obvious route is the building regulations, isn't it?
You're absolutely right, and to a certain extent, what this discussion is highlighting a flaw in the national planning policies, insofar as they don't by themselves lead to well-designed, environmentally sustainable design across the country. And you're right, they should. But perhaps,
yes,
given that local authorities have got that responsibility, maybe they should take it.
Yeah, understood. Interesting point, though, isn't it? Because obviously you may disagree with national policy, and you probably do, because it's not radical enough in some elements, in terms of, and you'd probably say the NPPF. Although then you can point to what it says about radical reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But what it doesn't do is require local authorities to go beyond the building regulations, does it? It allows them to in some circumstances, and I think the PPG still talks about, in terms of the building reg energy efficiency, I think it refers back to the Code for Sustainable Homes, and I think it's got a figure of 13%. I think that's still PPG. So, insofar as it tries to tackle that issue, it goes some way, but not very far. But that would seem to be. Anyway, the council have chosen to do what they do. But I will give some further thought to how the SPD. I mean, there's different views, isn't there? To some extent, the Green Party would want more radical approaches reflected in the policy, but also a retention to the reference to the existing SPD, because there's bits in it you wouldn't want to lose, whereas others may think that it'd be better just to have the policy up to date and then SPD to follow it. So I think they're the things I'll have to think about. Right. I'm going to move on to flood risk and water management. I know some people, and including Mr. Williams from JBA, are here specifically in case there are questions about this. I don't know if it will disappoint him or not, but I don't really have any questions about it, in the sense that, well, one, in terms of the approach to site allocations, whilst some small parts of some sites are within flood risk areas, I think I'm right in assuming that the development can be kept away from those, and therefore all of the development can be sequentially suitable in terms of NPPF terms and being in low areas of flood risks. So that's not a big issue in itself. In terms of the development management policy and the flood risk and water management, the approach, there aren't Environment Agency been involved in its preparation, and as well as some modifications suggested to it, and I think that's been brought forward and reflecting what the council is now proposing. There was one further suggestion about clarifying the reference to the mitigation by Helen's Land and Home England, about it being reasonable and proportionate. So I'll get the council to respond to whether that's necessary to make it sound, and then I'll see if there's any other comments that anybody wishes to raise. But before I do that, the council, have you got anything you wish to say about policy DC2 and respond to that specific suggestion by Helen's Land?
Nothing really further to add, sir. I think you set it out clearly in terms of our approach for the allocations and sites is there are elements that within flood zones, but very small parts of sites. But the sequential approach is encouraged, and we would be looking for that on those sites through the policy framework, through the allocation statements, and through that policy DC2. And basically, yes, DC2 sets out that sequential approach with some development management types, criteria within it. Yes, I picked up on that point from, I think it was Helen's and possibly Savills, about the mitigation measures related to risks from construction and the proposed use of sites to controlled waters. I think there is some flexibility within that part of the policy already in terms of where it says via mitigation measures where required. So it's not necessarily implying that they're needed in all cases, but at the same time, I take their points, and I think we'd be led by any advice from yourself, sir, whether you think that's required in terms of soundness to add in any additional flexibility.
Okay, thank you for that. Just in terms of, so we understood about the approach to allocations, and yes, and thank you for reminding me that the site allocation statements would be modified to be absolutely clear that the development accommodated other. But in terms of windfalls, and for example, we talked about the town centre fringe yesterday. I think it was mentioned that parts of that are at risk of flooding. This policy DC2 would be important because that would reflect the approach that would have to be taken when bringing forward sites that aren't specifically allocated. The sequential approach set out here and reflecting national policy would come into play in terms of the requirement for a site-specific flood risk assessment and things like that.
Yes, of course. DC2 would capture other sites coming forward and the town centre fringe area, and obviously national policy would also be considered. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything? No need to, but if Michael Williams has been patiently attending and listening, so is there anything you wish to say, Mr. Williams, before I open it up to see if there's any comments from others?
Nope, nothing to say on my behalf.
Fine, okay. Thank you very much. Right, okay, but thank you for being there, just in case. Right, any comments from any others on policy DC2? Mr. Madison.
Yes, still can't see me. I don't know what's going on with my camera, but I do apologise.
Don't worry.
DC2, one of the sections that I was a little bit confused over was number 3, section 3, that talks about discharging obviously through a surface water sewer or a highway drain. Now, in years gone by, that was an illegal an approach for domestic drainage, or in fact, obviously non-household drainage as well. So I'm not sure if that's an error. I appreciate that now Darlington are a highway authority, but that really will start to cause some horrendous issues if there are some drainage from domestic households connected to a highway drain. And then going further down, there is a section saying to avoid using public sewers wherever possible. And again, I might be a little bit out of touch, but I would have thought that that's the basic principle, that drainage is generally taken from a house into an adopted sewer, which then goes into a watercourse and a river accordingly, as opposed to missing out public sewers and going straight to the watercourse, which I appreciate will save the residents some money in terms of the surface water runoff charge, but I'm not sure if that should be advocated necessarily in here.
Okay, I mean, there's the bottom of the preceding page on policy DC2 before you get to point 3 it's a priority order, isn't it, of where the surface water should be discharged to. So the one that you picked up onto a surface water sewer or highway drain or other drainage system comes after 2 other priorities. Yeah, but understand your point. I'll get the council to respond to that. Any other comments?
I've got one other item on this particular subject. And specifically, I'm talking about the Baydale Beck itself, and it has its own issues in terms of flood management. The main arterial road in Staindrop Road actually floods and is shut about every couple of years because of obviously flooding, and that's because downstream there is a restriction, which is a tunnel that was built probably about 10 to 15 years ago. For all sorts of reasons, and I don't want to go into all of that. But I'm not sure if there's anybody in the council because as far as I'm aware, there isn't anybody directly responsible for flood management and risk management in terms of flooding. And it's obviously farmed out to a consultant, which I'm sure is absolutely fine, but not quite sure if these people have actually got a full understanding of the topography and some of the issues that we've actually got within the Darlington area. And I've said that particular site, and I know there's an application in for further up Baydale Beck to divert it into Cockerbeck. And that has stalled that planning application because of water quality issues, which is exactly against clearly what these policies are now saying. And I'm not sure if there is anybody who's got that sort of understanding. And just one other final point. I'm aware that a lot of retention tanks, call them whatever, SUD tanks, relief tanks, generally are adopted by the water company, but Darlington hasn't got a fantastic history and management profile for looking after them themselves, of which they've had to on 1 or 2 occasions. And should I just talk about large retention tanks that have got no fences to them and are situated close to play areas? Those are the types of scenarios that really are not going to help people in the longer term. And the retention tanks, for example, on the Coniscliffe Park development will need to be absolutely huge to be able to stop the water coming into Baydale Beck at a rate that it's coming in at the moment. Because I appreciate that whatever the area is currently drained into the Baydale Beck, for example, as applies to everywhere else. But if once you hard stand that and it comes off faster, the retention tank really will have to be absolutely huge. And whether it's mechanically or electronically operated, that's another issue altogether. I appreciate that's a bit of detail, but it's not particularly, I don't think, reflected in the policies.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments about policy DC2, water management and flood risk? Okay, does the council just want to respond to the basic points there from Mr. Madison about, well, I suppose the use of the priority order for the discharge of surface water runoff, the approach specifically to, I suppose the evidence and the knowledge there is about flood risk and water management, and the Baydale Beck issue, I suppose, in particular.
Yes, so just in terms of that, the hierarchy and the references to highway drain, that's taken from PPG, so it's set out within the guidance, and it's similar policies in the region have that hierarchy within it. So we've taken a similar approach just to make that clear to applicants that that's the hierarchy for surface water. In terms of Baydale Beck and the issues in that area, I think we have covered what we can in terms of local plan preparation, in terms of our SFRA and the sequential and exceptions test. That area does have a flood zone down the Beck Valley, and as we outlined at the beginning, that's taken account for in the policies of the plan and the allocation statements. I appreciate what Mr. Madison is saying though about more specific details and in terms of flood risk in the area and surface water issues. With regards to the SFRA, it didn't identify that area as having significant surface water issues. It did have pockets within the sites, but there wasn't a recommendation within the assessment to withdraw the site on those grounds. But obviously, the sites are subject to applications at the moment, and will obviously have more detailed flood risk assessments associated with them, and the appropriate bodies will be consulted, such as Northumbrian Water, the EA, and the local lead flood authority, that's Stockton, who advise us on those matters. So the more detailed specifics will be dealt with through the application process. I think that's all I could really say on those points.
No, that's fine. Okay, thank you. I mean, put the policy, there's a paragraph in the policy about surface water runoff rates and the standards that are expected on that, and that's so the fear that because you're going to build houses onto a site will increase runoff. Well, that policy is there to design to ensure that isn't the case and won't lead to flooding problems, and plus the non-development management sort of process checking. Yes, that's correct. So and those standards come from a national non-statutory sort of technical guidance document, which are also reflected in a Tees Valley document also, which is referenced in the policy. Although I noted that it's actually got just speaking to colleagues on this recently, it's the Tees Valley document's got a 2015 date, but I wasn't aware that it was updated in 2019, so that could be a proposed main modification just to reflect that. Okay, well, I think it'd probably be a minor modification. You can just do it as a sort of, it's a matter of fact that's just been updated, isn't it? So, yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Right, we will move on then to the policy DC3, which is about health and well-being, we've already discussed. I'm aware of the, there's a bit of context to health and the approach in the borough, and there's the Healthy New Towns, which is a national scheme that was from a few years ago. I don't know exactly when. Anyway, that's reflected early on in the plan in the Healthy New Towns approach and design principles. And we've talked about how they relate to the design principles that are set out in relation to specific sites and indeed reflected in policies in the plan. So that's a sort of context. DC3 is specifically a policy about health and well-being, and it does a number of things. It supports improvements, development that supports improvements to health and well-being are generally supported, and there's a series of measures set out there to show how that could be done. And it requires certain things in new developments to ensure that health and well-being is reflected in the design, layout, etc. of it. And then there's a number of specific sort of requirements about it as well. So understand that. One of the issues that's been raised is about the use of health impact assessments, which I know are a tool that have been around for a good number of years now. But it has been pointed out there's been a recent government guidance on health impact assessments. I think it's called Health Impact Assessments and Spatial Planning, that has been referred to by Helen's Land. I have to confess, I've not looked at it in that document myself. I don't know if it's in the library. I don't know if it was attached. But anyway, I don't need to get into that. But I suppose the point is, the question is the approach to requiring health impact assessment set out in Part G of the policy consistent with that approach that's now set out. So that's one issue. If you could comment on, please, Mr. Nelson. And the other main point in that is that it's the use of the environmental impact assessment and regulations, and when they kick in terms of 150 dwellings, and as part of that, the health impacts would need to be assessed. So is there a bit of a mismatch between with 100 dwellings referred to in G, and potentially would it be better to align it with the EIA regulations? So what's the definition? Why the rationale for 100? I suppose is a question there. So they're just a couple of issues I'd just like you to respond to. And then if there's anything else you wish to say about the approach to DC3, and then we'll pick up other issues that people have got.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I mean, just as a little bit of context, this is a policy that, as you've said, is important to Darlington, and it's one that members have pushed as well. We were one of only 10, I think it was, Healthy New Town demonstrators in 2017. So we've been keen to try and influence healthy choices as much as we possibly can, and acknowledging, the role that design and planning has in a number of those aspects. I mean, you've probably seen from the diagram set out at figure 1.3 there's a lot of things that are completely outside the realms of planning within those as well. So yeah. I mean, just in relation to the updated guidance, at the time we were drafting the plan, that yes, there was only, and then we acknowledge it was quite some quite generic guidance from, I think it was the Department for Health and Social Care, and much more recently they did publish one that was specifically related to planning. And I know a number of the people that made representations pointed that out, and we're happy we've included that as a modification to refer to that document rather than the predecessor, which did look at all sorts of aspects of just people undertaking business and things like that. So yeah, we're more than happy to update it to that more relevant and more recent guidance. In relation to the rationale for 100, I think that just essentially came from what we thought was a large enough development that would generate significant journeys, trips, travel, sustainable travel, demand on services, things like that. I mean, we would understand that 100 versus 150 for EIA regs. I don't know yet. There could be be merged, but equally, I think developments of over 100 or 100 or more rather, could be making positive impact on health and well-being. So, and I think in that context, it is a useful tool to just demonstrate, almost like a design and access statement, that developers have given due consideration to how they've designed their development with some of these principles in mind.
Okay. In terms of, you said there's a reference to the outdated guidance. Is that actually in the plan, in the reasonable justification, that you're saying you could update it to the 2020 guidance?
Sorry, so it's in footnote 10 underneath the policy there.
Yeah, it's a web link, isn't there? Yeah, health impact assessment.
Yes.
That could be updated.
Absolutely, yes. We've suggested that already, I think, on one of the modifications schedules.
Right, maybe I've missed that. Okay, so that's already proposed as a modification, is it? I suppose, though, the point I think seems to be, Mr. Bonner may want to say something in a minute, but that sets out a slightly more refined approach that you wouldn't have necessarily. I think what he's saying is, oh no, I'll tell you what, Mr. Bonner, let me hand over to you. Do you want to pick up this?
Thanks very much, sir. Yeah, if I could just provide a bit more context, really, as to why we made those comments. I suppose it's, as a practitioner in these, preparing EIAs and things like that, when you see the requirement for health impact assessment, it can be quite a complicated assessment that needs quite a lot of specialist input. And I appreciate it's something new and it's something that's come in, and people are going to get more, basically more familiar with what you require for a health impact assessment. But for us, it wasn't entirely clear what is required for HIA. I appreciate there's now a link to guidance, but that guidance does say that the very first step is a screening exercise. So in our view, it would be better to say it would be screened for health impact assessments, because talking about EIA, it is a format of, it's an element of the EIA regulations, population and human health, where you only really need to consider this if it's deemed to be a significant impact. So the council could still get the information they need from the developer to show that this is being considered, as to what are you doing to improve human health. But why is it, if it's not significant or it's not deemed to have a significant impact either way, then you provide that information, but then you don't have to take it further to a full HIA. As an example, at the moment, there's a screening and scoping opinion for Greater Favordale on the council's record, whereby this has been scoped out of the ES, but this policy would need us to therefore go back and do one, but it could be interpreted that way. But so you've got two separate processes competing against each other.
But I mean, even if you were to say, well, the HIA process should involve a screening exercise and a proportionate approach, you'd still need to know when the screening exercise would take place, wouldn't you? You'd still have to have a cut-off for a size of development where that would be the step.
Yeah, I think we'd said in the reps that you could make it, if you could potentially make that 150, so it's akin to the EIA regulations, and it makes it clear that if you submit something as part of the EIA process or otherwise as a separate document, which essentially provides the council with the information, so it's almost the first step is screening. The requirement of the policy could be to screen it, whether it needs a full HIA or not, but you've still provided a proportionate amount of information to the council on human health to understand what it is that your development would likely do to contribute or otherwise to that issue. It's just, is it really proportionate to then need to do a full HIA? That's just the can of worms it seems to open as to what is it, could that policy realistically expect of a developer, given that there's not I appreciate that, as I say, there's this guidance that's come out, but it's something that people aren't that familiar with at the moment as to exactly what they would need to do to meet that.
Yeah, I mean, on one level, you think, well, you've got DC3, so in one level, the test is, does the development comply with that? And if so, the planning issues to do with the way the development should accommodate and reflect health and well-being. If you comply with policy DC3 and other elements of the plan, well, that should be it, really. So why do you need another tool? I suppose the issue then is, well, health impact assessments are a tool that national policy refers to, and they can add value. So then I suppose it's when you bring them in terms of the screening and the proportionate approach. So yeah, I understand the concerns, and I'll get to Mr. Hall, then I'll come to Joanne Land. Sorry.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Bonner has very eloquently covered most of my points now, but the main issue we had was the inconsistency between the thresholds. So we would support 150. Obviously, we're involved in a lot of EIAs, including at Great Burden. But the other thing was, you follow that link, and I appreciate I've just followed the updated link. As he's just said, it does talk about the screening. So I would have thought, I think you're pretty much there with the discussion, but you know, screen it if it's required. Do the appropriate or commensurate amount of work, because it goes back to some of the things we've said, that this is quite a significant piece of work now. It's on a par with, writing a planning statement or doing an archaeological desktop now. Yeah. So it is another, and we're not saying we don't aspire to achieve health and well-being. It's more where it's needed, and then scope it appropriately, because we are also all learning from Durham, which you'll know about, where I've got a scheme of 100 and a scheme of 1800, where at the minute we're being asked to do health impact assessments, which on the face of it are very similar scale piece of work for both, and they're not necessarily comparable. And there's an EIA on one and not the other. So it just needs a bit of fine tuning, but Mr. Bonner got there first, really. But I just thought it's something we put in our original reps, and we're moving in the right direction, I think. But I've not really heard why they picked 100, actually. Was that something, and did I miss that?
Yeah, you must have been dozing off. I did ask the question and you did answer.
Can't remember what the answer was. Sorry.
But it was large enough to potentially have a significant effect, which, I mean, it's just a judgment, isn't it? I suppose procedurally I can see the logic of aligning it with the EIA. I'm just looking at the capacity of the housing commitments, and the housing allocations, and wondering how much difference it would actually make. But anyway,
yeah, which is a fair point. But it's just, I guess, we've got one eye on a future application, because it wouldn't, Great Burden's, in the category regardless because of the scale.
Yeah, I don't think it would make any difference, actually.
But there could be a windfall site that comes along and has to do an HIA, and maybe it's not appropriate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I suppose you could argue that if it's a windfall site, potentially, maybe an HIA is more likely to be needed because it hasn't been assessed through all the processes that assess the local plan suitability of the allocation. So anyway, look, I don't want to dwell on that any further, but let's bring in an expert on this, shall we? I think an expert. Sorry if I've misrepresented you. Joanne Land, thank you.
Hi, yes, to introduce myself just for context, I am a former, this is the first time I've contributed to these sessions, so some context may be helpful. I am a former resident of Darlington. It is the place that I have lived for the longest in my life. I used to campaign on retention of health services, social care services, and public health while I lived in the town. I'm now a research assistant in the Stress, Identities and Health Lab at University College London. So my advice here is based on a social determinants perspective of health, and as such, it's quite holistic. It goes beyond looking at individual health impact assessments for specific developments and looks out to a more holistic approach of spatially what are the effects of placing a development in a particular place, because I feel that the Darlington plan is as notable for what it emits as what it includes. Would you like me to go on?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the issue I'm grappling with is whether the requirement for health impact assessments is justified in terms of a tool. I think you're saying that. Well, no, you tell me. I mean, I understand the point about the holistic approach and well, you can, tell me what it omits is the key thing, but I mean, that may go beyond what the remit of what I can do. But then just to address this issue of policy DC3 in particular, whether there's anything specifically about that you think ought to be changed to make it effective.
Yes, I mean, I feel that it ought to more fully incorporate the Healthy New Towns principles. The guidance from the NPPF on health and well-being and documents such as Public Health England's Spatial Planning for Health, state that there needs to be promotion of active travel, and I'm concerned that placing large urban sprawl on the periphery of the town.
We've had that. I've got that point. I mean, that's to do with the spatial strategy and the justification of the allocations and all those sort of things, which we've had the discussion about, and those points have been made. I've got them, and obviously active travel is something we'll talk about as well tomorrow morning. So understand that point exactly, and I understand fully from a health point of view, those sort of they're very important because that affects behaviour and that can affect the health and well-being clearly. So I understand that fully. So when you say that the Healthy New Town principles are not fully reflected in the plan, and are they not reflected adequately in policy DC3 as the place where you'd expect to be able to see them recognisably reflected, I suppose, given the heading of the policy?
Sorry, I'll just open this document.
While you're doing that, just to say, I mean, the Healthy New Town principles are reflected they're in the plan. There's a diagram there earlier on, and that's that. So presumably they're the principles you're talking about, but it's then applying those through to the policies in it. I understand the point you make. Well, they're not reflected in the strategy because of the nature of the allocations and things. So I understand that. But in terms of moving on from that, are they adequately reflected in policy DC3 or not?
I mean, the key thing I would say would be, the active travel, and I don't think that's reflected throughout the plan. I don't think there's been given any consideration to planning for healthy food choices, which is, a provision of local food production. I don't believe that's anywhere in the plan. In terms of the principle of green infrastructure, within the Healthy New Town document, because of the allocation, there's going to be a loss of amenity land and also green space, which is inimical to the Healthy New Town principles. And also, I mean, a key thing is that the local plan is risking, and this may have been brought up on other days, I'm sure it has been by Joe Ellis, it risks creating this donut of deprivation effect because very little concern is being given to the town centre fringe. And having like a joined up approach to active travel, having compact living and working and leisure spaces and connectivity. Which I think are principles that are really embodied in the Healthy New Town principles, but I don't feel those principles have been fully considered throughout the whole of the document.
Okay, so it's
sorry if that's very sweeping, but I don't think it's enough to have a health impact assessment just for particular allocations. But I've covered that point, and that's obviously been covered elsewhere.
Okay, understood your point. Got it. It's about the spatial strategy and the allocations in the plan that you're concerned about primarily. I mean, in terms of active travel, policy DC3 says ensuring that new developments are designed to promote active travel and other physical activity through the arrangement of buildings and uses, access to open space and landscaping. Green infrastructure we've talked about earlier today, provision of and protection of. So I've got that. Okay, thank you very much. So Mr. Baker, if I could invite any final comments probably on health and well-being.
Yes, I mean, I won't go over the points made previously, but in respect of the requirement for a health impact assessment, I mean, the main concern we have was less about sort of thresholds and and what number of dwellings will or won't require such an assessment. It's more actually what form of assessment, what scope of assessment will be required, because just to say that something needs a health impact assessment, there isn't just one type. It can be quite a minor desktop-based assessment, or it can be quite a significant piece of work that involves primary research. So really, it's just about getting a feel for that. I mean, just for an example, a local plan that we were involved with in Sunderland, which was a core strategy that was very recently adopted. They've got a similar policy that requires health impact assessments for 100 or more dwelling applications. Potentially a reason why this authority perhaps went there as well. But in the case of Sunderland, they actually have guidance as to what that will entail, and they've got a developer guide, sort of guidance document, and they've got a sort of pro forma document that you can fill in or ensure that document is reflected in your design and access statement, for example, and that's specifically referenced in the core strategy. It discusses a proportionate approach to health impact on the basis of this guidance, and it refers to including an assessment, in the design and access statement, for example. So it was more about what is a health impact assessment, because it's not obvious. It can be quite a significant piece of work, or it can be a back of the fag packet, and which is it. So I think just a bit more guidance, or perhaps some reference to proportionate approach, or a specific pro forma, perhaps, or some guidance that will be brought out perhaps through a future SPD. I think that would just provide a bit more clarity, because it could actually, as Mr. Bonner has alluded to, be quite an onerous, significant piece of work when it perhaps doesn't need to be.
Yeah. Okay. Well. Okay. I can give some thought, and I think it's one that I'll ask the council to give some thought to. I think maybe the fact that it's got capital letters, health impact assessment, implies it's a sort of standardised procedure like environmental impact assessment, which it isn't, because there aren't regulations related. So I think even just removing the capital letters might help a little bit. Maybe something to do with some reference to being a proportionate approach. Clearly, there is national guidance now issued last year, so I suppose it is relevant to apply to that, to refer to that in the absence of anything locally specific. I'll ask the council if it wishes to respond in terms of whether it intends to provide anything more locally specific in terms of that or not.
And it could be that that's actually beneficial to the objectives that the council's trying to achieve, to make something a bit more targeted to Darlington's Healthy Towns agenda. Yeah. It could be more specifically targeted in that way, which I don't think we'd object to. It's more about providing that certainty as to the scope, because as you say, it isn't a standardized approach. It can vary dramatically from a power station EIA or NSIP sort of approach to something at the back of a design and access statement. So
yeah, understood. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Right, Jo Ellis has got a hand up.
Thank you, sir. Just with regard to health impact assessment and picking up on Ms. Land's point, I'd just like to, and also slightly going back to the previous discussion about design, I'd just like to point out that the failure to incorporate requirements with regard to density, legibility, accessibility and walkability will have an impact on the lifestyles of people living within those new developments. And we know there are correlations between the form of the built environment and the amount of walking people do, and the amount of exercise they take, and the amount of car dependency there is in an area, and hence the amount of pollution there is in an area. So so I do feel, just to reiterate, those items should be back in that policy.
In DC3?
Yeah, or they should be referenced within it.
Yeah. Well, okay. I mean, DC3, as I said, is clear about promoting active travel and physical activity. Yes, okay. Right. I mean, the density and the location development is, it's a fundamental issue, I suppose, in the nature of the allocations, which, you've raised, I'm aware of, I understand, and I understand that it will have impacts on the way people behave and travel and things in the future. So yes, it's there on my agenda of sort of, big things to think about. So yeah, okay, right.
I think we'd like to emphasise that it's a design matter as well as a locational matter.
Yeah,
and that it's a matter of layout and it's a matter of design.
Yeah. So to some extent, whilst even if you didn't accept the location of the allocations, the mitigation could be through very effective policies relating to density and layout and design and all those sort of things, would at least mitigate, if not entirely, to some degree, the potential impacts. Okay. Hence,
so it's about, if you have to do something, if you have to put in place a big urban extension, you've got to try and do it well.
Yeah. Okay. Understood. Succinctly put. Right. Joanne Land's hand is up, but I think you've made your contribution. Is there something further you need to add?
Yes, I'd just like to state for the record which articles of DC3 it is that that I feel that shouldn't be supported.
Yeah.
The Article C, where it says support the integration of community facilities and services, that would be more effectively delivered in a town centre location than in an urban sprawl on the fringe. I feel like very strongly, particularly with the pressure on town centres at the moment.
Hang on, no. So sorry, let me just interrupt. You're not objecting to the wording of this, but you're objecting to the allocations on the urban fringe again, yeah?
Yes, I'm not. Yeah, but it's. I don't believe that it does this.
No.
Okay.
Is there anything in DC3 that you think is wrong? Not I think spatial strategy of the allocations, because I've got your point about that. And so is anything specific about DC3? The words that you don't like, that you think are not sound, not that you don't like them all.
Well, to reiterate what Joe Ellis said, connectivity and density and considering the whole makeup and the legibility is a very important consideration, and it doesn't come through strongly enough with the wording of active travel. There really needs to be more spatial consideration, because in order to promote active travel, you have to have good connectivity, you have to have good legibility of the built environment, you have to have cycling infrastructure and walking infrastructure that takes people where they want to go on a daily basis, so that people can employ active travel, going from home to work, going to meet people, rather than using cars. So to just say active travel, it doesn't really go far enough without considering, the connectivity, the legibility and the density.
Okay, well, connectivity I think we'll deal with under policy. We've dealt with under the outside allocations. We're going to deal with as well tomorrow when we talk.
Yeah,
no,
I understand that, but if I could just say that there is a well-established principle of health in all policies, and in order to promote health and well-being, health and well-being permeates the entire plan. Health should be considered in in every part of the policy, and not just as an isolated thing that is to be dealt with through health impact assessments on isolated developments. I'm saying that it needs to be baked through everything that the plan does with regards to the points that I've raised.
Yeah, okay.
And the points that the Green Party has raised.
Understood. So in the sense of, insofar as the policies relate to specific allocations, the density, the layout, the walkability, the accessibility, the connectivity are all important health influences, and therefore to be adequately reflected in the statements and the design requirements for those sites. Understood. And yes, I've got that. And in terms of the DC3, I think the suggestion is in terms of this policy, there may be some words that are missing, which are around. We've got active travel and physical activity, but the words that you seem to be referring to, and Joe Ellis referred to, are the layout and design of development, and the density, legibility, and walkability are possibly the words that are missing. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Right, let's go back to the council then. On this, I think any points you wish to respond to, I think you've said you'd be willing to consider aligning the threshold for health impact assessments with the EIA for practical purposes. I'll give that some thought. I think some reference to moving away from the implication that a health impact assessment is a fixed regulatory sort of tool that there's a standardised approach to would probably be helpful. So some, maybe the removal of the capital letters, I'll guess if that's in the national approach, possibly okay. But anyway, some maybe reference to proportionate approach to assessing health through the use of health impact assessments, or something like that might be a wording that would help. And then I suppose the other point is, are there, in terms of the design policy itself, DC1, this policy DC3, are there elements of the design SPD that the council has, and the health agenda that has been referred to a number of times in terms of those sort of words about the density, legibility, walkability in terms of the design and layout development that ought to be reflected? You don't need to provide a definite answer now. I think it might be just one that you need to just have a little think about in terms of DC1 and DC3 in terms of good design and health and how it impacts on health. Anything you wish to say?
Thank you, sir. Just a few brief bits. I mean, we're happy to see what Mr. Baker was saying about that, ensuring that these HIAs are proportionate, and it is something, if it would help, we could look at producing some guidance and engaging with developers at a pre-app stage as well. So it might be, if say, we did keep the 100 dwelling threshold, that it looks like there are a number of other authorities that have adopted policies on that extent that there might be a more lighter touch approach to those compared to a garden village type scale of development. So no, we're more than willing to look at doing some guidance along the lines of I think it was Sunderland, the example he provided, but very much we'd feed that in through our DM pre-app process. Just as well on that legibility and layout and densities and things, I mean, I anticipate we talked in previous sessions about the use of design code on the large sites as well, that is something that they'd be picking up on. And just in relation to that interlinking, we do have a access and accessibility policy as well that we're going to talk about tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, design codes, master plans are all tools that will be taken forward, but they're all taken forward in the context of the policies in the plan and the principles there. So if principles aren't of legibility and walkability and appropriate densities are not in the plan itself, you could say, well, why would the design code reflect that? I mean, surely if they are principles that you support and you want to see reflected in the allocations, they ought to be there as the starting point. And then, as I say, the tools that are then used to actually carry them forward will know what they're doing. So I think it's not a great deal, but I think it's just thinking whether there are some key good design principles that are reflected in your existing FPA, that just the words are not there just to give the full sort of principle. I think DC1 probably is the place for them. I mean, you could say, well, no, I mean, health and wellbeing DC3, it is a self-standing policy, but I mean, in terms of ensuring that the overall design, it should be also reflected. I mean, there's no need to repeat, but there should be, DC1 seems to be the place you'd go first, wouldn't you, in terms of what are the core principles of sustainable design. So can I leave that with you? It's not necessarily a big thing. It's just thinking about those sort of the key principles there.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, thank you. Anything else on health and wellbeing? I did look, but I can't remember now. Was there a separate health impact assessment done for the local plan, or was it done as part of the sustainability appraisal criteria and objectives?
Yeah, it was part of the sustainability appraisal that, yeah, there were a number of the criteria there that looked at things like access to GP surgeries, access to bus stops, things like that. So no, it wasn't a separate one. It was part of the sustainability appraisal.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. Okay. Right. I think we're near at the end of the agenda now, and I didn't have any questions about safeguarding amenity policy DC4. There was a proposed modification to it, and these are sort of fairly standard. I mean, you can express these in all sorts of different ways, and I'm not going to get involved in a discussion about alternative ways of how you could express these things, but these are fairly standard sort of material considerations when you're considering the health, the impacts of developments, mainly on the living conditions of residents, but in terms of amenity in generally. So there was just one main modification, and that was some reference to the goods vehicles has been altered. So is there anything further you want to say about that or not? I mean, there's reference to the design of new development SPD again, so that's subject to whatever I decide to recommend about that. But you've already proposed a mod, I think, in terms of consistent reference to it. Is there anything you want to say?
Nothing further to add, sir, no.
The other DC policy we dealt with the other day, and there was an action point, I think, relating to that, or there will be an action point relating to that. Okay, so unless there are any other issues related to today's agenda or procedural questions, we will end there. I will, as I think I've made clear, there will be an action point further to this week that will probably be published at the end of the week or next week to pick up any things that the council no doubt will be taking a note of the things that we've referred to. Okay, so we're back tomorrow morning where we've got the transport and infrastructure issues to talk about. We have a session tomorrow afternoon, which was just to pick up any other issues that haven't been covered by the matters that we've already dealt with in terms of matters 1 to 10. There aren't many items there. They shouldn't take very long. Had there been a necessity to carry over some discussion like I did with ENV5 today that we dealt with this afternoon, it would have been an opportunity to do that, but I don't think there is anything. There isn't a great deal on the agenda for tomorrow afternoon. I may have a few words just to sort of say about what the next steps are, but really the only next steps I can provide any clarity about are that I will be doing another action point note arising from this week. The council will then have 2 or 3 weeks in which to respond to that, a couple of weeks to respond to that. And then what happens after that will depend on what the council's responses are to my action points. And as I've said previously, my sort of further consideration of the things I've heard over the 3 weeks of hearings, and a combination of those things will then lead me to decide what happens next with the examination, whether there's any further hearing sessions that are needed, whether there's any further work that are needed by the council, or any further advice I need to give in advance of moving to consultation on main modifications that will take place before I write my report. Anyway, I just thought I'd say that today. I'll probably reiterate that tomorrow, but some of you may not be there tomorrow, so it's a good opportunity for you to hear that. Okay, so unless there's any final questions or comments, we will end the session this afternoon, and I'll see some of you tomorrow morning.